I was given wine. We're feeling okay, ever quite alright. You wash my tears away. You make me wanna stay. And bonfires lit up the shores. One far, far away to go. Beside you is where I want to be. One far, far away to laugh, to know, to days of roses and wine, drifting astray. Will your hand in mine? You stroke my fears away. You make me wanna stay. In bonfires lit up the shores. One far, far away to go. Beside you is where I want to be. One far, far away to laugh, to know, to one far, far away to go and hide it. We're going to the sea. One far, far away to laugh, to know, to This is how it went. I'm here to stay, roaring with the wind. There's life within. This is what I get. A circle is complete. Another circle spin. There's life within, within.
This is a Victorian building that started off as a home for young women who became pregnant and out of wedlock, and because they were shunned by the norms of society at the time, they came here to this house, had their babies in secrecy, and then after the pregnancy, after the baby was given up for adoption, they would go back to their homes as if nothing happened.
Everything's normal.
Yeah. So, and then later on in the Depression, this was a men's shelter for homeless men. So this building has a long history of serving those who are abjected by society, those who are outsiders of society, those who don't conform to the norms of dominant culture. So in keeping with that tradition,
Yes.
Julius has transformed this, it was then a commercial space, and then he transformed this space with the help of volunteers into an exhibition space. And like those young mothers, over here, like those young mothers and like those homeless men, Julius is also kind of like an outsider of dominant society. So he's questioning the norms of society and specifically addressing homonormativity, or in other words, what dominant society deems as what they deem as normal, as a normal gay, what they look like and how they act.
An accepted visual, yeah.
Yeah, so he's critiquing those norms through his art, and he'll talk a little bit about the theories and what he reads and what informs his art practice. So I'm going to start by introducing Julius. So he was born in Manila in 1980, and he immigrated to Toronto in 1990. He obtained his BFA from OCAT in 2009, and he completed a one-year residency in Paris, France. And he earned a professional art studio certificate from the TSA, from the Toronto School of Art, and we have one of his teachers here today. Then he completed his Master's of Visual Studies at U of T, and he also achieved a certificate in sexuality studies.
Yes.
And when you'll see his art, you'll see how theory is really informs his art practice. His work addresses issues of post-colonialism, immigration, sexual identity, and identity construction. So maybe I can talk a little bit about the Wunderkammer, the whole idea of the Wunderkammer,
the Cabinet of Curiosity.
and then we'll move on to you.
Sure.
Okay? All right. So I'm just going to give you a kind of an idea of the idea of the Cabinet of Curiosity, or the Cabinet of Curiosities, which is the 16 and 1700 construct of elites. So the imperial elites would go do their exotic travels to colonial territories and collect specimens, whether they were from the natural world, insects, butterflies, oddities, and also man-made objects like works of art, and would bring them home to their house and display them in these exquisite, ornate cabinets. Sometimes they were entire rooms of all of these objects. So these objects were decontextualized, they were exotic, they were exotified, and it was very much a way for these elites to show status, like, look at all of my bounty from these colonial territories. So Julius is using these display techniques of the Cabinet of Curiosities for his show to talk about how certain queer bodies are exotified, are decontextualized, are elevated. And so we see a lot of the similar display techniques of the Cabinet of Curiosities. So the glace cloche is something from horticulture about the idea of preserving certain specimens. And behind you and in front of you, we have the glass. The glass display vitrines. So the mannequins are within these display cases. So it's this idea of these objectified objects that are on display for people to admire. There's 2 seats here and there's 1 seat there. So when you look at the work after the show, just keep in mind that the glass vitrines, the glass cloches, even these shadow boxes. So it's the idea of the entomologist who collects the specimens and keeps them behind a glass. So they're exotified, decontextualized objects. And so Julius is talking about how, how do you challenge those forms of containment. So these butterflies are images, are symbols of transformation and this elusive identities that don't really want to stay in patterns. They want to kind of break free. So as you see, these butterflies are breaking free from the walls. They're taking on new forms. They're being transformed. So he's taking the colonial kind of form of the Cabinet of Curiosity and is using it in a transformative way to show how society can change its values towards homonormativity. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, and he's going to talk about his previous body of work and then also how it transitions into this new body of work.
Okay, so I guess I just wanted to start how I kind of started from the beginning. My background was really in drawing and painting,
which you cannot really tell looking around you. There's really nothing much around with drawings. But for me, I always wanted to challenge what constitute as drawings, what constitute as lines. Cutting a paper that creates lines, creating lines with a mouse pad digitally. So for me, the beginning part of the drawing process allowed me to kind of re-challenge myself to find new materials to use to create an actual visual language. So the first image here is basically what I like to do is I like to kind of pre-sketch my ideas first and then kind of recreate the actual sculptures. And for me, it's always been planning it out, but at the same time letting myself kind of freeform sculpt things within a certain time frame that I have. These are the beginning pieces that I've done when I was doing my BFA at OCAD. I did a lot of studies of drawings, contours, and it was basically a lot about men. I noticed I just prefer drawing a lot of men. Lots of them. And I started to draw from magazines, from queer magazines and images. And for me, being a Filipino gay man, I'm constantly being bombarded by this ideal notion of beauty, this ideal notion of normative, this homonormativity that we kind of surrender ourselves to, we try to attain to, and it's that struggle. And for me, it was almost this mixture of anger and fascination. As you can see, I tried to kind of render them as realistic as possible. And then later on, I started to think about why am I using Conte and charcoal and paper and marker? And I remember learning that your material, your art materials, has a really strong, powerful message. So I decided to use different aspects of material. So the next thing that I went to is basically gay magazine, queer magazines, and gay porn. And I started to play around with the idea of pixelation. And my thesis work from OCAD was actually this 8 feet and a half by 8 feet and a half installation of queer porn pages that's been folded into origami shirts. So from afar, you see this image of just a regular billboard figure of a portrait of a man. And then until you look closer, you realize what it's actually made out of. And there's this kind of irony that happens between the structure of the shirt and the male nude body. So there's that juxtaposition. And for me, I found it quite interesting sometimes where the phallic symbol of the male penis sometimes would fall as a tie. It's always kind of reconnecting that idea of power dynamics between masculinity and the idea of what it represents as well. And also, a lot of my work then, it started to evolve as a dual vision, where it reads one thing from afar until you actually get closer, it actually reads another way. And for me, the most fascinating part is not really just the artwork final product of itself, but it's also the people's reaction. I'm really interested at people's how they react to aesthetics, how they react to images, to visual language, and what happens when they look at images from afar and up close. People's reaction quite dramatically change. And sometimes when they look closer, it's like, oh my God, it's so beautiful. Oh, that's just offensive. And for me, sometimes I would think, okay, I guess I've kind of done my job, because the interesting part is that act of looking and the act of understanding the actual image. And then I started to, this body of work started in Paris, and it was so full of history that I wanted to do something quite aesthetic driven. So I challenged myself, maybe if I cut out an image a day or a week and start collecting cutouts, all these cutouts. And when I was there, I didn't really have any funds to purchase any art materials. I really wanted to work with what was there, and what was there was a lot of French queer gay magazines and gay porn magazines that I could use. So I started to kind of filter through the images and start to play around with the idea of cutting and removing negative space and how the negative space can create a drawing lines. Hence, also constantly challenging myself the notion of drawing or mark making. And I started to really play around the idea of gender and gender play and the representation and challenging the notion of masculinity and femininity within queer society as is, what is mostly represented as this deemed valued thing as the queer masculine man. So for me, it was slowly, this is when I was slowly trying to kind of chisel into those certain topics that was really affecting myself personally and trying to kind of pull it out within my work. And then the series was basically evolving to this kind of transparent images where I love the idea of that other images seeping through the other side. This transparency, this idea of the duality of the representation of this perfection form of maleness. And then I started to intertwine cultural aspects. And I was very, very concerned every time I would open a queer gay magazine where other cultures is most of the time rendered invisible, and trying to look for myself within the community. And this was the point where it was a struggle to the point where how much do I really want to whitewash myself to fit in, to belong? And a lot of my work then started to evolve of questioning not only sexuality but also race and the ideal notion of queer identity itself. And this series became more and more and more, and then it kind of started to evolve into installation. So then I started to move outside of the actual page. I believe that maybe most people could have a better experience to go inside the work rather than being outside of the work. And then I started to create spaces that's, again, I tried to be as consistent as possible with my materials, with magazines and all of this other images and text. And for me, it's quite important because these magazines, these ideas that I basically collect, these are the things that kind of inform us how to live, what to do, what we should look at, what are deemed as valued within perspectives of people. And then I started to kind of really think about text. This piece actually has embedded text into it, such as bear, bag, twink, fudge packer, rice queen. Most terminologies that would render someone quite, offensive. But for me, I'd rather take those offensive slurs that have hurt me and create a wallpaper. And to me, the wallpaper represents this ideal notion of kind of like keeping up appearances. Let's cover up any kind of wounds. And it becomes this kind of highly elevated aesthetics. And for me, just by using those slurs and those texts allows me to gain control of those slurs, to gain control over those pain, and re-represent it into an aesthetic, into this kind of wall of protection. And I love the idea where people didn't even notice the text until they actually look closer. So again, there's that idea of the hidden images, the hidden ideologies of the queer society. And again, it also came into term to about the idea of coming out. Well, what is this thing coming out of the closet thing? Why do we have to come out of the closet? Why do we hide ourselves? So for me, the wallpaper really carries a lot of historical ideas within the context of what I was trying to do here. And then I started to basically remove the images as well. And the idea of just by removing the representation of the normative, I am now questioning that blank space. That blank space could become anonymous. That blank space represents anyone, whoever it is. And I started to kind of elevate that figure into historical representation of male aesthetic. So I started to use classical paintings, classical sculptures, and started to basically capture their silhouettes. I don't know if you use, some of them are from paintings from religious iconographies, like the Adam and Eve. And what I love to do is basically reappropriate those historical representation of masculinity or maleness, or this is a man, this is a woman, and readjust it in a way to recreate a new queer context. So now I basically take what is given to me visually through history and reappropriate it in my own interpretation and rewrite it, how to speak, in a more contemporary, modern situation. And also by infusing them in quite highly aesthetic interior spaces. And then so it kind of just grew, and it started to grow this kind of shapes from pornography, from magazines, and at this point I have become desensitized with the idea of nudity. I saw it merely as is wonderful form, the shapes, the actual flow that it gives to the images. And then again, always constantly thinking about the material, what else kind of material could I use? And to me, my work always is informed from my own personal experience. So for these pieces, I decided to use my marriage license with my husband, and I decided to construct an entire interior house out of paper, out of basically our marriage license. And in this installation, I wanted to challenge the ideal notion of home, of family structure, what is deemed as this normative family constructs, and question that myself within queer context as well, especially with the gay marriage and the idea of adoption or creating a child. So again, I started to compose the wallpaper that kind of evolved within the space. And here you can see the chandelier and the lamps, the side lamps where the bed is, specifically constructed with cardboard and paper, and making sure that the light actually works. So this idea of function and non-function, and how it kind of represents that idea of the functioning home, or the lack of it, it's rendered useless because you cannot use this furniture. So to me, I was really interested into the idea of the whole idea of crafting it, the whole idea of homemaking. And then I started to craft the child's bedroom. And what I've done is basically created them from boxes. So I created this fictional child that me and my husband would have, where it's half of me and half himself. Also questioning the idea of the structure of parents and children within the queer idea of family, queer family. So the boxes that I've used is the Balik Bayan box, which Balik means to return, Bayan means a village, and it's a box that we use to put items in to send back to the Philippines. And this box really represents that idea of cultural exchange, this idea of relocating, and traveling. So for me, it just really made sense to craft furnitures out of these boxes. And again, constantly thinking about this material. Why am I using this material? Why am I constructing it from these pieces? And then I decided to kind of create this kind of hybridity of mocking the family crests. And started to infuse the crest of the Philippines, Canada, and French, and kind of like create this kind of new hybrid form of the symbol, the symbolic, the symbol of the crest, which represents this idea of family structures. And this is basically how I appropriated this fictional child that kind of grew. And I kind of pushed the idea of the gallery space itself, because I believe art can happen anywhere. Why does it have to be locked in a white cube and concealed? So for me, I always try and find other venues, other appropriation to create art pieces where people go, oh, what is this? Oh, is this a piece of art? What is this? So I decided to create Christian James, the fictional child's own Facebook profile. So if you follow this child, every year the image would change and the child would get older and older and older. Someone told me about the story of how when the Spaniards basically colonized the Philippines, they started building the idea of religion. And basically, they started building these churches. And what happened was the volcano started erupting and covered the entire bottom of the church until all you see is the top part. So to me, it was kind of fascinating how that kind of constructs of nature, kind of like reclaiming things. And to me, it kind of like, it made sense to create a backdrop for the constructed shrines that I was creating. And these are the details to that. And then I kind of pushed it more. So I started to construct crucifix from using the flesh stone from these gay magazines and gay porn images, and constructed in a way where I would even project images that questions cultural identity, images that also questions commodity. If you look at this kind of hybrid god deity that overlooms the crucifix, you can see the Nike symbols, the Chanel ads, there's Louis Vuitton ads. So to me, what I find interesting is always kind of inserting the work with hidden things that people might miss. And then when people kind of relook at the work, they would actually start to see other things within the piece itself. And this is just the detail of the pieces. And then I started to get even closer to use myself as the main subject, considering a lot of my work was very personal subject matters. And I started to infuse my image within my cutouts. And then I started to kind of evolve to the idea of performative. Hence, one of the pieces that's in here that was performed at the Rivoli, where I have to actually go inside this Queen Elizabethan dress, this hybridity of half colonial, half the colonized and half the colonizer. So for me, just being immersed within this kind of hybrid form is really that part of the performance and the performative aspect of it. And then it started to trickle down more about race and more about cultural identity. The idea of the difference, of importance, of changing and transformation. So this is when I started to think about transformation. Hence the show now, talking about the butterflies and the idea of transformation. There's a staggering amount of skin whitening products in the Philippines that we use, and then I would go here, and then the staggering amount of people tanning themselves. I'm like, really? So that's that kind of push and pull of this idea, these two notions of beauty, these other notions of which one do I kind of accept or not accept? So I started, most of you probably know what this magazine is. So I started to play around with the whole idea of the image, where I would start to draw Asian features on this very Caucasian queer male images. And then what I would do is I would start bleaching the magazine. So there's this idea of the role reversal, where the image is also being removed. It's the idea of that reversal whitewashing itself. And then it started a whole slew of series. So it kind of just grew and grew to other kind of aspects of it. And then it brought us to this recent work, which is the Cabinet of Curiosity. And I wanted to really basically tackle the idea of really going back to the Filipino culture. As the costumes, as you see, are a form construct of hybridity. What it is basically indigenous costume design that has been appropriated and mixed and blended with colonial clothing that was brought in by the Spaniards, which is the Barong Tagalog and the mestiza dress, which is that big butterfly sleeves. So for me, it was crucial to kind of recapture that idea of transformation, that changing, that blending. And the butterfly cut does represent the idea of change, of growth, of that idea of context of the body of self. And also there's a LGBT political party in the Philippines called Ladlad. As you can see, the past work over there at the edge. And their symbol as well is the butterfly. And each butterfly in here are actually carefully researched, and I specifically chose certain templates of butterflies that are indigenous to the Philippines and kind of re-template that. And Googling gave horde images to just get the right hues and color and texture to kind of craft this butterfly digitally. So for me, it's really becoming more about the digital aspect of image exchange. So here I am removing myself from the materiality of the magazine and moving myself to the exchange of images that is given to us through Google search, to the internet and the sites and webs. So for me, it really, again, pulling out that idea of normativity, that constant image that we constantly see out there in society as within the queer community as well. So for me, that idea of repeating the butterfly itself acts as that kind of template of that repetitive representation. And if you look closely in most of the butterflies, mostly all of them, the body of the butterfly is constructed with the male genital, the penis. And for me, it's a very powerful symbol in a way that it really made me think about this queer theory book that I've read called Racial Castration. And it talks about the feminization of Asian queers. So here I am castrating the porn images, the masculine man, and then retransforming them into butterflies. So there's always that context of switching the viewpoint, reiterating it, and basically challenging the notion of where I stand. So for me, a lot of the work is basically also questioning the viewpoint. So now I am kind of not only, I am no longer the subject matter of the exotic, I am now the collector. And for me to put myself in that situation, that whole practice really challenges that idea of collecting the exotic. And to me, it was so fitting with the title, especially with World Pride, that idea of the queer, in every queer society, it's always that sense of oddity. So, and that collective idea of visions of cultures, of different appropriations. So to me, it was very, very fitting to use Cabinet of curiosity within the whole work itself. And if anyone has any question, we're gonna leave the last part of it with questions and answers. Yes?
Okay, so at this point, if you have any comments or questions about his previous work or the work that's in the space currently, this is the time to ask. Or it could be just responses, it doesn't have to be a question.
Yeah, actually I wanted to say thank you for presenting your work. My training is in queer studies, and so I was going to say, and I know David, actually David Ang, the person who cites.
Oh,
right.
So,
I was going to say that one of the things that I really thought was powerful about your work is and rarely have I encountered this as an artist who is so theoretically versed in the kind of not only process of creation, but also the process of not only the cultural production, but rather the reception, the very materiality of what you're creating. And so I wanted to hear more about maybe, I was really also struck by a real attention to the Philippines itself. So like not the Philippines as the sort of space that people imagine it to be, but rather the Philippines as a land, right? So that actually the butterflies become so connected to a particular understanding of landscape. So I was wondering, is that a conscious effort as an artist to really kind of bring back, right, or kind of and like you said, recite or re-articulate these sort of norms of Philippine masculinity or whatever?
I think I think it kind of brought me back to, because the idea of masculinity and femininity, and where does it lie where someone could be both, because I remember going back to the Philippines where the queer representation is quite different. The males are very flamboyant, the females are very butch, and it's rarely you see the cusp in between. So it's a quite different dynamics of queer culture between there and here. So to me, I wanted to kind of challenge that notion as well, and kind of question it at the same time. And then what does happen to the queer Filipino who immigrated here, who is now re-transformed in a way as the butterfly would, where if I would go back home, it would feel like part of me still does not belong. And yet I'm here, a part of me is kind of like doesn't belong as well. So in a way, you become this person where there's no man's land, where you do not belong in a tangible space, but you start to belong into an imaginary space. And to me, a lot of my work is searching for that longing of belonging. And I think through my artwork and through that kind of oddities or queertopian images and other things, where even though there's no tangible space, there could be an imaginary space, that other space, that third, fourth, fifth space within itself.
Thank you.
That's great, thank you for your question. Yes.
Yeah, I wonder if you can elaborate a bit more. On that wall, there are 4 big frame images. It's very, very dense, very repetitive, and also very symmetrical. Yeah.
Oh, this piece is specifically the photo itself is. So what I started to do is I started to use myself as a subject matter, no longer the actual images that I would find in gay magazines and gay porn magazines. So I would start to pose in the same mannerism and kind of like start superimposing myself to another self, to another self, to another self, and that idea of repetitiveness and that layer of covering, of changing, kind of like repeating that idea of transforming constantly, reiterating, constantly kind of asking myself, who am I supposed to be as being queer and Filipino, and again by infusing the butterflies and entrapping them within those visions, within those kind of contexts. It's also challenging me how I need to basically reiterate myself visually to retransform myself, to fit in within the whole community itself, within the whole homonormative community itself.
If I can just add on to what you're saying, I think those pieces there, it's also very indicative of your style of ornamentalizing. So you see, you take the the homophobic slurs, and then you ornamentalize them. You're taking images of yourself and you're ornamentalizing them. So you're remaking your own subjectivity. That's the way I see it. It's kind of like you're using the ornamental to remake and perform your new identity.
Okay.
Tim.
Well, first of all, I really enjoyed the slideshow of works that you showed, and I really like the evolution of what you started out, how it started to what it became, being like this very two-dimensional thing, and then it took up spaces. And I feel like a lot of the concerns of people of color are finding spaces for people of color, especially queer people of color. And I really feel like it spoke to that. And I was wondering, I mean, just like looking at a lot of the works, they are white bodies. And if you, in your magazines and the sources that you use to create these pieces, if you've encountered Filipino bodies or Asian bodies, and if you would include them in these pieces. And
you know what, the fascinating part is at the beginning, maybe years ago, it was quite difficult. But slowly, I do start seeing them, but then it's also, it's very passive. And to me, it's quite important to represent the not so passive image of the queer man, because to me, the question lies are that identity of the masculinity, the identity of the butch, straight, acting queer man. Not only in different cultures, but also within the homonormative culture itself. That idea to keep up that kind of macho kind of facade, which again also echoes a lot of the screens, the cutouts, that covering and the unveiling, that transparency as well.
And that also, that also alludes to your use of the hypermasculine mannequins.
Yes, and it was hard to look. I tried to look for Asian mannequins, Asian short mannequins. I can't. It was not gonna sell.
No, so sweet, tall, and blue eyes, and they're beautiful. And then as well as the Ken dolls. So it's iconic. It's an iconic image of white masculinity.
What's so fascinating about the Ken dolls is it's already been castrated. So here I am giving them their masculinity back with the butterflies itself.